been a couple of weeks since we talked about it, but the Israelites, they left Egypt with the Pharaoh chasing them and went through the Red Sea. The Egyptian army failed in their task of bringing them back. Actually, they failed altogether because there was no Egyptian army after that for quite a while. But it's interesting when you look at the archaeology of all that, how the Egyptians tried to hide all that. They tried to wipe any trace of it away because it was a shameful thing to them. But anyway, the Israelites wandered through the desert, and it took them just a few days to get over to Canaan, where the promised land was. And they sent these spies in, and the spies came back, and 10 of the 12 spies says, we just can't do it. They're too big for us. We're like grasshoppers to them. They're too powerful. And God decided to teach them a lesson. So after that, they wandered through the desert for 38 years before they arrived back at the border of Canaan again. And we've seen in chapter 3, Moses, who had led them all that time, was not allowed into the promised land. He had to turn over his reins of power to Joshua, who had been his assistant all that time. Joshua was also one of the spies that went in. And him and one other guy named Caleb were the only people allowed from the first generation to go into the promised land. Everybody else was new people. So God brought them to the border here, and he rolled back the waters of the Jordan. And to me, in some ways, it's just as great a miracle as rolling back the Red Sea, and almost just more impressive, because it says he used a strong east wind, I think it was east wind, to roll back the Red Sea, but here, he just basically created a impenetrable barrier in the middle of the river, and it was dammed up all the way back to the north. It says as far as Adam. We don't know where that was at, but it was way up the river. And then the rest of it drained down into the Dead Sea, and the riverbed was dry, it tells us here. So all the nation passed over the Jordan. A couple of million people, from what they estimate, maybe as many as 3 million people, all their flocks and herds. It must have took a long time to do that, but we don't know how wide the place was they went across. They could have went across for a mile up and down the Jordan. So it probably did. So after they finished passing over the Jordan, it tells us here in Joshua 4:1, when all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. So we've seen over in chapter 3 where the priest went ahead of the people when they went down to the Jordan, and the people stayed like a half a mile behind them, and they went down and they stood there in the midst of the Jordan with the water on one side and dry on the other. They stood there with the poles on their shoulders holding the Ark of the Covenant, and the people passed below them. And they stood there all that time. They must have been some pretty well-trained guys. Of course, you got to realize these people just walked thousands of miles, so they're in pretty good shape, I would think. Through a desert, not to mention that. But and Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan. according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. For the priest bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, and the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people passed over in haste, and when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people. So everybody went over, everybody went across the Jordan while it was dry, and then those priests, those poor old priests that stood there all that time, they trudged up the bank, and it was done. Just as the Lord commanded Joshua, it said. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. Now those people were just from those particular two half-tribes they call them. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And the Lord said to Joshua, command the priest bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priest, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priest bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priest's feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. And then we go over to verse 1 of chapter 5, which is really a logical ending to this. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit to them because of the people of Israel. That's Joshua 4:1 through 5:1. So what they're talking about here is remembering. And you know, when it's an essential part of Christian discipleship. It's an essential part of us as Christians. And it's a human activity. We're always, you know, Jim gets up here every Sunday and asks how many birthdays and anniversaries there are. Those are memorials. You know, we like to mark things. Sarah tells me all the time, you like to schedule everything. And, you know, she's more of a freewheeling type. But I do. I do. I schedule everything, and it just brings me comfort to do that. But we remember our births, our anniversaries, our marriages, noteworthy events in the history of the nation. You know, Memorial Day just went by. 4th of July, Independence Day is coming up pretty soon. We like to have ceremonies to remind us of that and all that. And so these memorial stones taken out of the midst of the Jordan were used for a monument. They were piled up there, and I'm sure for generations, Israelites would come by and say, that's where we crossed over the Jordan. Our grandfathers crossed over the Jordan right there. I can just hear them say that. So we don't know eventually what happened to those stones. Probably somebody down the line, that's what happens, you know, is you try to remember these things. And if they weren't in the Bible, those stones probably wouldn't have been remembered for very few generations. You know, probably 5 or 10 generations down the road, somebody said, there's a pile of stones out there and I need to build me a new walkway or whatever it was. And they would go get them. Those are big stones. They're going to look good on my driveway. And that's kind of what it was. But what do these stones mean to you? So that was put into mouths and minds of future generations of Israelites who would come by and look at that. And of course, eventually, someone wrote the book of Joshua, which gives us a record of it. So in a way, those stones lived on. In a way, they did. So each man was to take a stone from the middle of the Jordan's bed where the priest's feet were anchored, while the people pass over, and put them at the new campsite, which marked where they first came into the promised land. And it was a momentous thing because it changed history when they crossed over the Jordan. So here they had unity of their nation. One of the rare times after that they had total unity. You remember the tribe of Gad and Manasseh. They wanted land on the east side of the Jordan. They wanted land in what's now Jordan. They call it Jordan because there's a big plain there, and it was good for farming and cattle. Mostly for cattle is what they had. So they wanted that land. And so Moses said, okay, but you're going to send your military guys, your military age guys over with us to fight until we've conquered the land. And so 40,000 of them did. So if those two tribes were 40,000 people, how many people did Joshua's army have in it? Well, we don't know, but I imagine it was a big army. It was, I imagine the North Koreans don't have anything on them, because there would have been a lot of people there. So that was to be a sign. It was to be a sign for us. So future generations need to know. And that's kind of like with us, we need to have signs to show future generations what's going on. Kind of like the guy's chair, I know I've always thought with all the furniture items and stuff I've made down through the years, I just know that the only one that'll survive a few generations is probably my junkiest piece, where I was just learning to do it. And it's some crude thing that I did early on is probably what's going to survive. Not my finest work, that's just the way it goes. But here in verse 7, it indicated God was in the midst of his people to deliver them. They couldn't have got across the Jordan probably for a long time. They'd had to wait till the river went down. It was in flood stage. And then they would have had to either got boats or they'd have had to ford the river at some point. It probably would have took months to get across that river. And in the meantime, all those Canaanites and Amorites would have been attacking them more than likely to take advantage of them. So, but it tells us twice in verse 7 that the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And then look at the stones, that's the evidence that they were cut off. These stones that have got piled up here didn't come from over here, they came from the middle of that river. And the guys walked them out without any scuba suits or anything, without any cranes. They just put them on their shoulder and walked out. So everything worked good because God was in control. So verses 11 through 14 give us a summary of what's happened from chapter 3:1 on. And they said all the people in verse 11 who'd been east of the Jordan are now across the Jordan confronting Jericho. So this didn't include the families of the tribes that remained in the east, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. But their fighting men did come across, 40,000 of them. So verse 13 highlights the obedience by the 40,000 warriors joining the Israelites for battle. So it ends up with a unified nation across the Jordan ready for battle. And they not only that, but they recognized Joshua as a true successor to Moses. His position was solidified. So it's a parallel to crossing of the Red Sea. It shows a big change in their life. It said the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. That was during the Red Sea thing. So the parallel here is probably pretty intentional, showing that God established Moses as leader, and now he established Joshua. And so the people were united in their awe of Joshua, Joshua 4:14, or fear of him as their divinely appointed chief man. So And then you go back to the main narrative here. So it kind of tells us in 5:1 what's going on with the other people, not the Israelites, but the Amorites and the Canaanites, especially the people of that big walled city over on the hill that I'm sure at least people who climbed up on a little knoll could see from where they were camped, and then people on the wall could see them. And you know, they were probably storing up more food, getting more weapons ready for war because they knew that the Israelites were going to attack them. It was pretty common knowledge. It was not, they didn't come across the river in isolation. They were probably spies watching them from a distance from the Canaanites. It said in verse 1, their hearts melted and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So they seen these spies, these Amorite and Canaanite spies, people from Jericho and some of those other towns, they seen the waters backing up. And they thought, man, I wish our gods could do that. We need to go home and make some bigger ones, you know. That's what Isaiah said, you know, about idolatry. He said, carpenter he takes a piece of wood and he makes this idol and then he bows down before it. Kind of showing the silliness of that. But their hearts melted and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So when the presence of God was removed from the river, then the river flowed back under natural conditions. Supernatural had left. So the stones were there for these people to learn the lesson of what happened. So the dating in the event in the calendar was the 10th day of the first month, Nisan. So it also indicates here divine control. That's the day when the Passover lamb was selected in preparation for its sacrifice on the 14th day of the month. Tells us about that back in Exodus. So it underlines the connection of the entry into the land with the Exodus from Egypt 40 years earlier, or 38 years. So the resting place chosen for their first night over there was Gilgal, where the memorial stones were set up. And so it reveals the two great reasons for the entry to the land being done in a miraculous manner. So first of all, God wants to know that he wants everybody to know at that time and even now that the world is in his hands, that power is in his hands, that whatever he wants, he can do. You know, God can suspend natural laws as easy as we, you know, eat breakfast or whatever. He can do whatever he wants to do. And there are times in history, we have many, many times recorded in the Bible where God intervened in a miraculous way. And we have other examples outside the Bible. You can't always trust them, but you can trust what's in the Bible. And so he's the creator of everything, and it was his design that he had this relationship with Israel, which they ultimately, sadly, messed up. And so as the Old Testament goes on, you see these accumulated failures and utter disregard of God that went on during Israel's history. But here God acts on a political stage, an international stage, to demonstrate his hand. And it's for Israel's benefit that you may fear the Lord your God forever, verse 24. So he wants them to know as they settle down for their first night of rest that number one, he's in charge. He's their God. He's mightier than any of these idols. That if it weren't for their God, they'd still be in Egypt. And they'd still be growing watermelons and making brick for Pharaoh and whatever they were doing. And if it were not for him, if he'd abandoned them when they came out into the desert, they would have starved to death. They would have died in the desert from being attacked by the desert's people. They would have died in the wilderness. And if he hadn't gave them a second chance when they decided it was too scary for them to go in the first time, he could have left them out in the desert again. And so they have to be remembering this all the time. So He's the mighty God who alone can do wonders, and he can do it for us. We can't deceive him. We can't manipulate him. We can't lie to him. We can't get away with anything. We can love him because he first loved us. And that's a pretty awesome thing that he loved us. So when they saw the 12 stones at Gilgal, it's be a memorial forever to the faithful provision of God. So what about us today? It shows us that our hope is founded on God, that all our hope is founded on. He constantly does mighty things for us, and some of them we don't even recognize. It's pretty much a miracle we're all here today when you think about it. You know, when I was a little boy, somebody 65 years old was old. I remember people my grandparents' age, they all died about 65 if they did real well. And here we are, most of us are older than that. It's a miracle in a lot of ways. So we can look back at our lifetime and see what God's done for us. And we have God's word. You know, the Israelites only had what the priest told them, or what God told them directly, or what Joshua told them. But we have the stones right here. We have the stones recorded in here. This is 66 stones that we have here to remind us of what God's done, what he continues to do. So we need to remember. And you know, we get busy in the flow of life because mundane things take up most of our day. They do mine. I mean, I get up in the morning and we do whatever we're going to do in the morning. That's just what we do. And during the day, you know, we're doing some kind of work or something all the time. We're busy. And so we need to remember, we need to think about God as much as we can and what Jesus himself has done for us. So that's another reason why we gather here, why we're here today, you know. We gather together to remind ourselves of what God's done for us and what Christ has done for us. And so, and to remind each other and help each other with our problems and our temptations. And so we need to have a deeper appreciation and be reminded constantly of all those basic things. And that's the 12 stones. One of the big remembrances we have is right here. It's called the Lord's Supper or communion. Do this in remembrance of me was Jesus' command to his disciples in Luke 22:19. So that's what we're going to do here, because it's a greater miracle really than the crossing of the Jordan. You know, crossing the Jordan was nothing compared to what Jesus did. I mean, God was just kind of warming up then, wasn't he? The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me, Paul in Galatians 2:20. So we need a visible reminder of what our salvation means, and that's what communion does. And it commemorates the great victory that Christ got at Calvary. And our slavery is ended. We're like the Israelites. When Jesus did that on the cross, he ended our slavery to the world. You know, I just have to throw this in, but I seen a picture yesterday of the Gay Pride Parade over in Washington, and it was a guy driving a Volkswagen Beetle dressed as a nun, and some other guy in the back looking pretty strange, but we've been saved from all that because that's human things that's happened there. You know, those people really deserve they deserve our help and our pity. God, we pray that God saves them, but we all can tend to get into worldly things if we're not careful. So the Lord's Supper is kind of like those stones at Gilgal. It reminds us of what Jesus did for us. And it's done so from all the generations since Paul's time when it was instituted. And so it has continuity. So we're to feed on Christ in our hearts by faith and thanksgiving. So we need to have a renewed commitment to action. That means we're redeemed. Revisit the goodness of God's grace and recall from one another what that means to us, and be reminded and encourage one another all the time. So, and be reminded that He'll be around forever. We may not be here, but we'll be with Him forever. That's quite a promise. God speaks, we obey. God acts, we remember. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all His benefits. So the more we recall His character, His goodness, His grace, we need to help us focus our thinking on that. And so if you guys come up, we'll have communion and we'll celebrate the memorial.